We're at the German Underground Museum in Lavallettee in the parish of St. Peter Port on the island of Guernsey. Your postcard today. Evan, we are underground here. Well, almost there's a shaft of light there, and at the back there's a lot of artifacts, regalia, ceremonial. Where are we?
We're in one of the tunnels built by the German occupying powers during the occupation of Guernsey, Russell, between 1940 and 1945. They planned 40 altogether for Guernsey alone. Of course, there will be more on Jersey. And they planned 40, but they only completed about 6 here, and this is one which they completed. It was thought maybe, because there are some very large fuel tanks in here, there were 4, there's only 1 left now, it was thought maybe that they were going to be used to refuel U-boats which could go in the bay just beyond this underground tunnel. But they were enormous complexes. In fact, the whole of the island is covered in German underground positions. They brought in a total of 270,000 cubic meters of reinforced concrete on this island alone.
Where did they bring it from?
All of Europe. As they came through, they captured equipment and materials, and they just brought it in. So they had an enormous shipping operation bringing this stuff in, and of course weapons as well, because many of the weapons on Guernsey used by them were French, Dutch, whatever. A great mixture of equipment and material here.
So did they bring craftsmen with them, like masons and stonecutters too, to build like some of these huge bunkers we see on the island?
Yes, they brought in an organisation called Organisation Todt. Todt was a civilian engineer, and he had this enormous organisation before the war of civilian contractors who were building the autobahns in Germany. And then the war came, and they brought 5,000 of their foreign workers, forced to come here. They weren't volunteers, not in the main anyhow. They were forced to come here and build these bunkers day and night.
So let's go back then to the invasion of the Channel Islands, specifically Guernsey, as we're here.
Yes, of course.
What actually happened? What led up to the invasion of this island?
Well, of course, Hitler had come right through Paris, conquered Paris, captured Paris, and then his forces had come straight up against the Channel ports, St. Malo and Cherbourg. And of course, just across was Great Britain, but even closer, a little bit left, were the Channel Islands, and they were British. And so it seemed, presumably to him, to be an ideal propaganda weapon to capture a bit of British property. And so they came in on June the 30th, 1940, and landed here. They did bomb the harbour before they landed at the airport, because they saw a lot of trucks going out, being loaded onto ships, and they thought they were British military personnel. In fact, they weren't. They were loading tomatoes onto ships. And they bombed the harbour and killed 30 of our local civilians. But then they landed at the airport on the 31st, I think it was, and for 5 years then they occupied Guernsey.
Was there much opposition?
No, there wouldn't be any opposition on Guernsey. It was too small. There was no resistance, unlike maybe in the major countries of Holland and France. No, there wasn't. There was a little bit, and some of them were deported for having radios and other things they did, which the Germans didn't wish them to do. But so it was complete German military authority. But of course, Hitler was going to invade England, and this was Operation Sea Lion. And then, when he started planning that, the Channel Islands would have been a very useful stepping-off stone to get into Britain. And of course, they would have brought back their wounded from the front in England. They would have brought them back to the Channel Islands, because both Jersey and Guernsey have 2 enormous underground hospitals.
Yes, we visited on a previous postcard the Jersey Underground Hospital,
indeed.
Which is massive.
Well, this one's even larger on Guernsey, I would say, so it
Is
wouldn't
it?
die.
Is this a donkey toad
Absolutely
again?
so.
I noticed round the corner too, the reason I asked if there would be much opposition to any kind of invasion was I see the Guernsey militia are actually represented in this museum, but it's a different war completely, isn't it?
Absolutely so. There would have been no Guernsey militia at that time, no. We would have had garrison forces here, but they would have evacuated Guernsey well before the Germans landed. So no militia here, no military resistance at all, no.
What about the vehicle behind us? Are these all part of what the Germans brought over as part of their, occupation of the island, so that life would run as normally as could possibly happen?
Yes, well, they obviously brought a lot of equipment in, including small tanks and trucks. But this one happens to be from the film set, The Last Crusade, and it was built for Indiana Jones driving in that film. But they would have been similar to trucks that were brought in, very much so.
And up there are horse saddles, so presumably to get around this small island, horses would have been as quick as cars.
A lot of horses here at the time, and bicycles. And of course, as equipment ran out, like bicycle tyres, so they had to improvise. And towards the end of the occupation, of course, there needed to be a lot of improvisation because food supplies, or they were coming in from the Red Cross for the civilians. They obviously weren't coming in for the Germans, particularly when D-Day started. So the German occupying forces were suffering towards the end, as well as the civilians during the whole of the occupation.
Did they take that out on the local populace?
I'm sure there were some very difficult German soldiers, but in the main, no, they didn't. It was a fairly benign occupation because, of course, one of the reasons that Guernsey and the Channel Islands were useful to Hitler was if Operation Sea Lion had become successful, in other words, if he took control of Great Britain, this would have been a pilot scheme to see how civilian population behaved under German military authority. And of course it never happened. Russia, the Russian front started dominating. Operation Sea Lion was cancelled, and he sent most of his young men, of course, across to the Russian front.
As you wander further down, you begin to see how these islands really did have to take so much battering. There's a Nazi flag here that was brought back from Germany to the island, and all along here this whole wall is peppered with stories of, for instance, people executed for espionage there, somebody else who was sentenced to death for trying to release a pigeon over to Britain to get messages through. And in here we have the model, a tableau scene of Germans, as they would have been, sending messages back to the main communication centre, which is in St. Peter Port, perhaps a mile just down the road. So when you come here to this place, you get that sense of history that you can only get by looking at artefacts, real newspaper headlines, and just getting the scene as it was, transporting you back those many years to when Guernsey and Jersey and all the surrounding islands were the only parts of the British Isles that were actually ever occupied by Nazi Germany. Now you see, as you look around the museum, such newspaper headlines, such as, "Evacuation is a lie."
Yes.
Was that to stop alarm spreading?
Yes, I think it was, although we were evacuated. I was evacuated indeed with my parents because I was one at the time. But yes, I think they wanted to stop panic, total panic, but in fact the civilian population were allowed to evacuate, those who wished to, and many stayed behind to look after their houses, and they were stubborn and didn't want to leave. Why should they? But many did evacuate. Schools were evacuated en masse. Some, of course, children went with their parents, and men of military age, of course, got out as quickly as they could. Otherwise, they would have been captured and taken to camps in Germany.
What about the local newspaper? Was that taken over by the Germans?
Yes, it was. There was censorship, in the sense they took that over, but it still ran, communications ran, entertainment was here. People had to carry on with their lives as best possible. And the cinemas were operating, albeit with German propaganda film, but people entertained in their own houses, and there was a little amateur dramatic society, and people still fished when they were allowed to go out certain areas, and farmed and grew tomatoes. They had to carry on with life.
Looking also along the wall, the very sad and tragic circumstances of people who were executed
Yes.
for basically trying to get messages to Britain.
Yes.
And all kinds of things.
Yes.
That's a really sad side, because a lot of people have spoken about, since even I've been on the island, it's really a myth about collaboration in the sense of the word, that you needed to live your life.
Absolutely. I think there was resignation by the Guernsey people to some extent, because of course who knows how long the occupation would have lasted. They could have been under German military occupying forces, as well as Britain could with Operation Sea Lion, forever. And of course, when Hitler reinforced the islands, he was determined that they would remain under German authority forever. 1,000 years, I think was his word. So there wasn't collaboration in the sense of assisting the German forces. I think there was certainly some resignation about behaviour by local people towards the German authorities. But I think that's inevitable when you have so many hundreds, thousands of German occupying forces here. And yes, as you read on some of the notices, some of the foreign workers, in fact, were executed for misbehaving, using radios, etc.
I think the little radio sets, they were obviously trying to tune into the BBC, presumably.
Very much so.
And possibly could do it better then than you can now at times. But there is one that I really like, because I think there is a message in itself. It's a little matchbox with England's glory.
Yes, yes.
And a radio, and I think that symbolism says it all, doesn't it?
It epitomises the feeling at the time, I'm sure, yes.